So it claims I've shown my screen. Are you seeing VIVO currently?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So I guess maybe just to quickly review what I guess it was last time what Chris showed. We looked at how to load an ontology into VIVO using the GUI interface. Oops, that's not the login I really wanted to do with this. That's what I want. And so that's one approach for putting a different ontology or different content into VIVO is that you can go and do this add remove RDF and load things that way and do the reverse operation. You can select remove and pull it back out. But there's also another sort of sneakier way of doing things that might be useful in certain applications. And to sort of understand a little more about how it works, we should probably kind of quickly review how things are stored generally in the triple store. And so this page that we were looking at last time, this add and remove RDF data, I think we sort of alluded to the issues with what graph the data ends up in when you use this page. That there's something called a KB2 graph, and there's a vitro tbox graph, and sort of these funny sounding names, which are the sort of default storage locations that things get put in when you use this form to add and remove data. But there are other different locations that you can store things in, and in fact, which are used by default by VIVO. And you can control what goes into those other storage locations. And to just kind of quickly look at what's there, if I go into this ingest tools page, we can look at all of the different graphs that are in the store. And the graph is just basically a set of triples that has a name associated with it. So within your triple store, you can just think of it as being compartmentalized into a bunch of different buckets, each of which has a name, and there's just a big pile of triples sitting in that bucket. And it's often useful to be able to divide them up into these different boxes so that you can manage them in different ways. So if I go and look at this manage genome models, and they're in the VIVO application, sometimes you'll see the word model getting used, and sometimes you'll see graph getting used. They essentially mean the exact same thing. It's just this named set of triples. And so we look here, there's a couple of these default things that are sort of built right into the basics of how VIVO works. And this is this infamous vitro KB2 graph. This is where all of the data that you edit when you use the editing forms about, say, a person or an organization, anything that you're creating data about for the individuals in the ontology, those things get put there when you're editing through the GUI. And then there's also this asserted tbox graph. And so if you're editing the ontology through the GUI, if you're creating a new class, if you're creating a local property, things like that, those get put into this asserted tbox graph. And similarly, if you do the technique that Chris was demonstrating earlier, where you're adding a new ontology or removing it from that add remove RDF page, this is that bucket that it gets either added to or removed from. And so there's some complexity there if you're adding different kinds of things and removing them, because they all go into this one spot and they all get pulled out of this one spot. And that's where we were talking a little bit about the idea of making sure that when you're removing data through the remove RDF, that you don't remove too much, because if you upload a file that has too much stuff in it, you might end up pulling out other stuff that's also kind of all mingled together into that one bucket in the asserted tbox. So it's sometimes convenient to be able to manage extra data that you want, or extra ontologies that you want to put into VIVO into separate boxes where you can go and add them and remove them, and they're not going to get contaminated with any other kind of data. And in fact, that's actually what's used for the VIVO ontology when you just fire up a new VIVO out of the box, and it comes with the VIVO ontology pre-installed in it. That stuff actually gets put in different graphs. And so if I scroll down here, you're going to see a bunch of other different things that have this file graph word in them. So in fact, actually, that's one that I'm going to talk about in a moment. But things like this BFO bridge and BFO owl and clinical and contact vCard. This is where the vCard ontology lives. And so these are all the different pieces of the VIVO ISF ontology that get bundled with VIVO. They live in these separate graphs, and they're called file graphs because they get loaded from an RDF file that's sitting on your server. And so we're going to go look at how you can change the files in these that are used for these file graphs so that you can have VIVO automatically load or remove different ontologies or different sets of data just by changing the files you have on your file system. So I'm going to go bring up over here. I hope you can see this because I don't think I can easily change the size, but just looking at the file browser here. This is the VIVO home directory for this VIVO installation that we were just looking at. And in here, there's an RDF directory. And some of you might be familiar with going and editing in this directory because there's this display directory in here, and there's an every time, and there's this property config file, which, oh, am I in the wrong spot? Anyway, if you're edited faux properties, for people who have dealt with that, you're used to editing your display model. But there's other kinds of RDF in here that you can change and do different things with for loading in different ontologies or different data. And for that, within the RDF directory, there's these tbox and abox subdirectories that you can put different things in. And what the tbox is, that's the ontologies. That's your classes and properties, things like that, that are actually part of the ontology itself. The abox is for any data about actual individuals, actual people, organizations, publications, things like that, you can put into the abox. So let's pretend that we want to go and load new actual ontology and upload some classes and properties the way we did last time, but we'll do it through a file graph. So if I go into this tbox directory, and we open up the file graph subdirectory within that, you can see there's a whole bunch of ontology files in here, and they correspond to the kinds of things that we were just looking at in the list. So there should be, there's contact vcard. We were just looking at that. All of these different files get loaded by VIVO and put into those separate graphs, those separate little boxes in the triple store. And we can put in a new file into this directory and have it automatically create a new graph. So somewhere kicking around here, I've got a little OWL file that I found on the web earlier. I think it was something called the pedagogical diagnostics ontology, something related to pedagogy and various problems that students might have. But it was just something I randomly found and grabbed and sort of took a little small slice of it that should be manageable to work with. So here's a little OWL file that I found. I'm just going to go and plop it right into this file graph directory. And now I'll go shut down my VIVO. And start it up again. And so these file graphs, the files in these tbox and abox directories, they get read at startup time. So if you want to change something that's in those directories, you have to shut your VIVO down and then start it back up. And as it starts up, it'll go and read all of the files, and it'll adjust your triple store so that all of those file graphs will match what's currently sitting in the file. So if any of those files change from the last time you started up VIVO, it'll go and reload the data so that the data in your triple store is in sync with what's in those files. And hopefully this should only take about 30 seconds or so. Let's see what we got here. While we're waiting for that to finish loading, any questions about that so far?
This is Suzanne. Can you hear me?
Hi, Suzanne. Yeah.
Hi. I'm calling from the Smithsonian, and I'm not sure if my my compatriot who actually understands this a lot more than me, is on the call or not. I haven't been able to reach him. But I want to just real quick ask again, the tbox is where you're putting a new ontology. The abox is more for the individual people? Did I get that right?
Right, yeah, so it's the tbox and abox we end up using just because they're sort of convenient, geeky shorthand a lot of the time, but they come from, so the T is the terminology box, and the A is the assertions box, and so the terminology is the actual classes and also the properties by convention in the ontology, and the assertions are the actual things you're saying about the individuals. Yeah, the A box would include things about actual people. So if you're saying that a person is of a certain, or an individual is of type person, and then that person has an authorship, and that authorship is linked to a publication, all of that kind of data is part of the A box. But when you're defining what the folk person class is, or you're defining what an authorship is, that stuff lives in the T box.
Terrific. And then you quickly said something about in display and the faux properties. That was in a whole nother area that we're not talking about now, but I would love to understand the faux properties at one time and display.
Yeah, we should make that a focus of another call, because yeah, it's a useful and fundamentally sort of simple concept, but it's quirky and yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense the first time you hear about it.
Yeah, I would love hand-holding on that. So I would love that for a future agenda. And then one more thing is the link that someone put in the chat box for the Google Doc, I'm not getting to. Is anybody else able to get into it?
Yes, I was it. Paul just sent me an email, so yeah, it looks like. Sorry about that, guys. There you go.
Terrific. Thank you. Okay, I'll be quiet. I'm back to mute. I go.
No, thank you for the question.
Okay, so it looks like we've got our instance back up, so I'm going to go log back in now, and now we should see this. If I go to my ontology list, I should see a new ontology there once the page loads. Yeah, it's this thing here, and if I go and look at the classes that are defined here, there should be a lot of strange, classroom, component of personality. These are all of the things that came from that file that I just dropped in that directory, restarted my VIVO, and now they're there. And so if I want to go, so say for example, next week there's a new version of this ontology that gets released, and I want to be able to update my VIVO to use that new version, all I have to do is just pull out that old file, drop in the new file, restart my VIVO, and it's automatically going to update to show exactly what that current version has. So it's a little bit more convenient in some cases to be able to do that than if you have to go and retract, remove the old thing and then add a new thing and make sure that when you're removing, you are removing exactly what you think you're removing. The advantage of this kind of approach is that what you added in that file is just nicely compartmentalized in one place, and all you have to do to change it is just change the file, and VIVO will automatically follow those changes when you restart. So that's an example of adding something to the tbox. You can also do a similar thing with the abox. So if I go to abox, the directory structure is exactly the same. There's a file graph thing sitting here, and I probably won't do another restart because I don't want to waste all of our time, but you could go and drop some data in here, and so earlier I had grabbed some SCOS concepts that were defined by the New York Times for different organizations and drop those in there. And if you do that, then you can come back and look at your index, and there's going to be some new SCOS concepts sitting there. So it's the same exact approach. It's just you have your ontology bit in one directory and the tbox, and you've got other kinds of data about real things sitting in your abox file graph directory. And I think just the one last little point I want to make about this is that when you put something into a file graph and it goes into one of those extra other little named buckets that's not part of the asserted tbox graph and it's not part of the KB2 graph, so that it's not editable by the GUI. It means that you can't go and change things around through the VIVO interface. And the caveat is that it sort of looks like sometimes you can, because if I go and bring up one of those new classes that I brought in through that file graph, I can click on it, and it sort of looks like I can edit it. Let's see what I want here. So I'll go click back on this and click on one of these classes. And in fact, the same thing applies to all of the basic things like FOF person and FOF organization, because they're also loaded through file graphs. But it's important to be aware that if you go and click on one of these classes and edit it, it looks like you can change things, and I can go and change the values in the form. And what will happen is that if I change something about this class, whatever new value I enter into the form is going to get stored in that one common bucket. So it's going to go into that asserted tbox, that vitro default asserted tbox graph is where that new version of the value is going to go. But the old version will also be there because it's in the file graph and the interface can't change it. So you can end up with sort of multiple values of things in different graphs. And so you just want to make sure you don't, anything that you want to be able to change and edit through the interface, you don't want to load through a file graph. But if it's just a static ontology that you want to have in there because you want to make instances or you want to use it for to be able to link to other things with, this could be a very useful approach. And just the last little detail about that is that to poke a little bit into this other directory that we've got here, and I think we're going to go back to tbox. So we've been looking at the file graph directory, which is where we can put in our new data. There's also this first time. And what the first time is for is that these directories only get read one time. They only get read when you're starting up a brand new VIVO or when you're starting up a new version of VIVO for the very first time and it has to go through the data migration. Then it will check these directories. And so we were just looking at how the tbox file graph has all of the different pieces of the ISF, like your vcard and data properties, object properties, and clinical and research, and all these different bits of the ontology. They have almost all of the pieces, except some of it gets put into the first time. And so if I open up this file in here, you'll see a lot of things like labels. Because in the ISF that we load into VIVO, we want you to be able to change the label of a class or the label of a property because those things show up in the interface. So we want to make those things editable. So we've pulled out things like labels and some of these other values like the display limit and display rank. These things get pulled in to this other directory, so they're not part of the file graph. And that means that they're managed in the common graph. They're managed through the GUI. You can change the value through the form and have it stick and update to what you want it to be through the form, while the main part of the ontology, all of the actual things saying that FOF person is a subclass of FOF agent, all of those nuts and bolts pieces of the axioms in the ontology, those live in the file graph because those are frozen and they don't change. So that's just something to be aware of, that if you want to be able to edit something, it needs to be outside of the file graph. But if you want to just load it in, have it be there, and use it, then the file graph can be a convenient way of doing that. So I think that is the basic gist of it. Any questions or things that were confusing about that, or anything else you want to look at related to that topic?
Hi, Brian.
Yes, Brian.
It's Alex from Brazil. Hello.
Hi.
Hey, Alexander.
Hello. So the approach should make it much more difficult to sync the ontology with. So suppose that I'm using an external ontology from another group or another project. So this approach of split information from more the statical part of the ontology and the more dynamic part, it should make the life difficult to sync with new version of the ontology, right?
Are you asking it whether it does or doesn't make it difficult?
It should does it probably, right? It does things much more difficult, right?
Right, yeah, that would make it more complicated. That if you want to be able to, if you're updating something, but you've taken out pieces of it because you wanted those to be editable in the GUI, then yeah, that complicates things. And that's the kind of somewhat complicated logic that VIVO ends up having to deal with anytime it does a version upgrade that includes an ontology change. It has to go through and check to see, well, did you change the value of display rank from the previous default value in the old version? And if so, then we should keep your new setting. But if you left it at the old default, then we're going to give you the new default instead. And so, yeah, that becomes a more complicated kind of thing. And if you want that same kind of effect with other ontologies that you've loaded, you would have to manage that yourself because the application wouldn't know how to deal with those things.
So my last question is, and my last question connected with that is I wonder if this is the reason of the way that the VIVO handled the external ontologies like FOF, cause, and things like, and all other ontology, because the files that are actually in the file graph are not the original files of those ontologies, are just parts of the ontology, statements of this ontology that are exported from that ontology and imported in VIVO. So is there any connection of this situation that you just described, the limitation of the file graph, and this approach to use external ontology? Because in the beginning, when I started to work with VIVO, I was expecting to see, when I saw the full file, full OWL, I was expecting to see the whole full ontology there, but that's not the case. We have just the fragment of full ontology.
Yeah, so there's there's a couple of levels involved with that, because where those files come from is, first they're taken from the official release of the ISF, which itself is a copy from these different external sources and isn't necessarily a complete copy. So that's the first stage of sort of filtering that you get. And then for the VIVO release, we don't include the entire ISF by default. So for example, there's a lot of clinical, medical kind of things that come from the Eagle Eye side that don't get loaded by default into VIVO because it's a lot of data and there isn't necessarily a lot of demand for it at the moment. So some of those things get chopped out of those files. And then there's the additional level of things like the labels and some of the other annotations on those classes and properties that we want to make editable. Those also get pulled out into the separate files that are loaded through the first time mechanism so that you can change them to the GUI. So yeah, there is sort of a chain of sort of slicing and dicing of these files that happens, and that's something that until now has involved some kind of arbitrary manual decision making to get those in the right spot. But Shahim and Matthew at OHSU are going to be working on sort of a more automated approach that's going to be able to feed into that production of those files for the application-specific use, so that hopefully will be a little more transparent how that happens in the future.
So there's another question for Brian.
Brian,
hi,
Paul,
Brian.
Go, Max.
Thanks. This is Max. Were you saying for those editing ontology work, it's better to stay outside of VIVO, right? So if I have a local ontology file, I mean here is what I did. Like I added by PostJ and load into a file graph, and anything wrong, I remove that one, remove this previous version, and get a new one load in, right? So is that what you said?
Yeah, so that sounds like a perfect kind of application for this kind of approach. That yeah, if you're producing a file, an OWL file with Protege, and you just want to bring it up in Vivo and see what it looks like, yeah, you can just take that, drop it into the file graph directory, restart your Vivo. It should be there. If you want to change it, drop in a different version of the file, shut your Vivo down, restart it, and you should see the new version. So yeah, that would be a very logical sort of approach.
Okay, yep, sure, thanks.
Brian, this is Shaham. So in that scenario, if the previous version had a class and was used in the data, and the new version does not have the class, what's the best way to handle changes in the ontology if the data already used the ontology?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah, no, I mean there wouldn't be any. So if you loaded in a new ontology, say this thing we were just looking at with the diagnostics, and you wanted to go create a new individual of type classroom, and put that in your Vivo, and then you turned around and pulled that diagnostics ontology out of your file graph and restarted, yeah, suddenly you would just have sort of this orphaned data, where there'd still be an assertion in your Vivo saying that something is of type diagnostica classroom, but that class wouldn't be there anymore, so it wouldn't get displayed properly. And yeah, at this point, there's no kind of logic that's involved to say, oh, well, something should change with the instance data because this file graph changed. So that's just something you'd have to be aware of and manage on your own. That if you've got data that depends on something that you've changed, then yeah, you'd have to change it yourself. And I mean that's where in the future we could think about the kind of logic. So there's more complex logic that happens in Vivo itself for the data that it knows about in the ISF or historically in the Vivo ontology. When you're upgrading from one release to the next, there's a migration path, and then there's some extra logic that as it handles the changes from one version to the next, it can then go and attempt to do some migration of the data as well. And we could think in the future about being able to have some additional metadata about these other graphs, that if you've got a new ontology in a file graph that you've loaded, we might be able to somehow say, okay, well, if you have one version in this one graph and another version in this other one, then the migration will be able to go and potentially do some kind of automated conversion of the instances. But yeah, that gets sort of complicated. But yeah, so the short answer is that right now there's no additional smartness for dealing with that. You just have to manage that on your own.
So Paul Friedman had a question. Let's have one last question for Brian, and then I think Steve has some stuff to show us.
Yeah, just quickly, Brian, when you drop something in the file graph directories, what file types are available? Are you any OWL, RDF, N3, Turtle, or is it limited?
Yeah, as I recall, it should be able to handle all of those. Yeah, it should be able to, based on the extension of the file, if it's .owl, .rdf, .n3, .ttl, or .nt, it should be able to handle all of those.
Great, thanks.
Did you say those one more time so I can get them in the notes? OWL, N3, RDF?
Yeah, OWL, RDF, and so those two extensions would be if it's RDF XML.
Right.
.n3 would be N3, .ttl would be Turtle, and then if you're using N triples, then .nt should work with that. And in fact, actually, since all of those get now handled by the same parser anyway, it shouldn't really make much difference. But as I recall, it should recognize all 5 of those file extensions and load those. If it has a file extension that doesn't match one of those, then it will just get ignored.
Well, thank you, Brian, for coming and showing us this. I think there's a lot of things I learned here about where the file graphs go and how they get loaded that I think would be very useful. Stephen, are you ready?
Yeah, I am. I actually had a question for Brian.
All right, go ahead. Go ahead. Well,
No, you know, let me just put it out there. I'll put it out as a statement rather than a question because he's had to talk enough. But I will say that you know, we've run into the deal with sort of having to separate out the ontologies that you're loading and the ones that you want to edit. And I know that one of the things that we like a lot about VIVO is using it as an interface for editing linked data. And while we've had to go through some of these sort of, you know, workarounds in the workflow in terms of loading and editing ontology, I don't know what sort of obstacles it faces, but it would be great if we could, you know, make edits to the ontology and then push them out to the existing files. But again, I know that that might be opening up a can of worms. You know, for the time being, we can certainly just export the ontologies and then use those to load up into the file graphs. That's what we're doing. Anyhow, like I said, I didn't want to get Brian talking anymore. I guess I'll get going with
no,
our local.
that's a great statement. And while you get set up, that's you know, one of the things that I'm interested in is making it easier to use GitHub to edit the ontology files and have people be able to do pull requests and share them. So being able to load them after you edit them is pretty important. So.
Yeah, you know, and we actually have our. I don't know if are people looking at my screen right now. By the way.
Yep.
All right. So in fact, yeah, I can open up. We have our ontology out in the GitHub repository, and yeah, it'd be great, you know, if we could sort of get sort of a, you know, a cycle going between Vitro and GitHub, our edits and our commits and things like that, and sort of keeping everything synced up. But again, that would just be, you know, in sort of my the dream function to have. It would be nice if we could use VIVO both for editing our data and our ontology. But again, time's short, so I guess I'll get going. Unless you have anything else to add, Chris?
No. I'm hoping that you might, when you get a chance, talk a little bit about why you guys chose to put your ontology extensions in GitHub, and if you have any kind of semi-automated way that you bring them back into VIVO when you load them.
You know, we've been, you know, that would again be the sort of workflow that we'd like to have set up. Right now, we don't have anything even semi-automated. For the most part, we just make our local changes and then push them up to the RAB Vitro or the RAB ontology, which is what you see here, and that is just sort of our source of record for ontology, and then. We were working on something that would pull out the existing ontology whenever we rebuilt VIVO, but I don't know if we put that in place yet. Anyhow, so here is our ontology, and for the most part, since it's not automated, it's mostly just on GitHub in the spirit of sharing, and like I said, keeping things in order. So here in the README, you've got a quick breakdown of what you can see here in the ontology. Yes, yay sharing. And of particular interest today is right here, our local extensions for modeling what we're calling researchers at Brown data. So these are the files. Sorry, it's the commit history. And right now there's just 3 turtle files. And, you know, as Brian was showing, this is free to peruse. But we also have some documentation up in the form of graphs that were made via View and also saved in PNG format. And these just sort of show off, give people a quick overview of what we've done. This basically shows the breakdown of what a faculty profile page is comprised of right now in Brown's VIVO. So we've got overview and web pages, photos, CVs, research, but for a more sort of deeper description, this shows off what the main sort of entity relationships are in our Brown VIVO. And a lot of these are standard VIVO data, but there's also some of our own local additions. So this is the Vitro data. This is the sort of the data properties associated with a person. As you can see in the B local being one of our primary points of interest. That was our original ontology extension, and then secondary ontology extension being the B site. So basically, we have three main ontology extensions: B local, B display, and B site. And walking you through them relatively quickly. B local was our first extensions, and those primarily served the purposes of migrating over our old faculty profile database, which you can see here in some of the text areas like research statement and scholarly work. And in addition to that, adding in some sort of application specific metadata like short ID, which is what we're using for an identifier, this being metadata showing when faculty profiles were updated in our local faculty information system, FIS. The next ontology that we added is B display for Brown display. And the primary function there is, right now, its main use is in affecting the organizational browse in Brown. And so rather than basing that on the basic VIVO classes, we made some Brown-specific groups that, both serve some of our political interests here at Brown and also agree more with how Brown faculty and Brown administration wants to describe the organizational structure. In particular, you see here centers, programs, and institutes, which are all separate kinds of organizations, but here at Brown, they're all sort of on the same plane. The final and probably the most thorough ontology extension we have here is B-Site. And that got into supporting some of our interests in, for a bit of background, the primary use case of the Brown VIVO is as a sort of a faculty content management system. Each faculty member is in charge of maintaining their own page, or they can hand it off to a delegate, which is actually another local extension that we see right here. And we want to make things as easy as possible for the faculty members to get their profile pages. Let's see, I have a question. Something about where we deploy the, let's see. All right, so we added the B-site ontology so that it would allow us to provide an easier editing interface for the faculty members and to allow them to get their profile pages, in particular their publication lists, looking the way they want them to look. All right, so we have a question from Suzanne. What do you call that in the changes? Wait, follow that ontology. Well, the way that we essentially, as Brian, I'm actually very grateful that Brian spoke before us, because we sort of load up the ontology. I believe actually we include the B-display ontology in the file graph when we load things up, and so that's sort of loaded on its own. And then, as Brian was showing, it's just included in the ontology list on the site admin page. And as you can see here, if you want to add a new ontology, you can just add one there, where you can load it up via the add remove, or as Brian was describing, through the file graph. Does that answer your question, Suzanne?
I apologize. I really didn't want to. That's why I put it in the question mark so we could come back to it. But I was wondering how you would get it to enact the display ontology so that your display actually changes. But that sort of morphs the conversation. And I think people would like you to finish your thought about the B site. I didn't mean to distract.
Oh, no. I actually, the B display thing is, in my opinion, one of the things that I kind of like, because it's a very sort of straightforward application. I can continue talking about the B site, I guess, but I would like to come back to that. So basically, the main thing that we did here was that we separated the the idea of the citation, which appears on the faculty profile page from the sort of VIVO document object, which we have over here. And, and especially the other thing we do is we flattened out the structure as much as possible because from our perspective, we're not really interested in the different kinds of citations. We have these subclasses of citation just so that to improve the organization on the faculty page, but as far as we're concerned, they're all sort of the same object. As you can see, the VIVO concept of a document is sort of as the actual physical work, the actual paper, and we ran into some concerns with that. The one most glaring concern being that we can have two faculty members co-author the same document, but they might want the citations to appear in different formats on their pages. And so we needed to have a presentation level that was distinct from the actual document, the canonical document itself. And so in the spirit of sort of a kind of iterative design, the immediate function that we needed was a profile page that was functional and that the faculty members could edit easily. And so we'll worry a little bit more about connecting up those citations with the canonical documents afterwards. Again, so I'm sort of running out of time a little bit. So this is, as far as the B-display thing goes, this is one of the nice functions about it. So we add the B-display classes, and one of the things that we try to take advantage of, one of the great things about RDF is that it's not, the class structure isn't hierarchical. You could have the same object be a member of multiple classes from different ontologies. So, we can have the various things that are members of the Brown display classes are themselves members of the standard VIVO organizational classes. And the Brown display classes are just used via the, I believe, it's going to be page management. And so we make this the browse class group. And so we just add the class group is going to be from Brown OUs as opposed to some of the other VIVO classes, and then that's how we just use that to make that the source of the VIVO browse. Not sure if I'm explaining that correctly. I hope so. But basically, VIVO allows you to make any classes that you have available the subject of your browse, and so we just made the B-display classes the browse page for organizations. Does that make sense? Well, anyhow, that is the sort of quick overview of what we've done. And I guess I'll, rather than going on, I can open up the floor for more questions and hopefully clear up anything that's not obviously clear.
We got a nice work from Alex. No question.
That's good.
Hey Steve, this is Max. So what version VIVO you're running? I only saw you probably using you're probably use 1.5 VIVO ontology structure, right, to model your.
So we actually, we're highly customized at this point, Max. So we're running Vitro 1.7, but yeah, we never really migrated our data over to 1.7. It's still based in 1.5, but essentially what we have here, and this is the for the in our docs relationships, the relationships file over here. This sort of shows off. We went through and documented pretty much all of the object and data property relationships that we have in Vitro. So this is about it.
Yeah.
So at this point, it's very much sort of ad hoc in terms of what it is that we need to see in VIVO right now. So it's probably somewhere in between 1.5 and 1.7, and also off in its own direction a little bit. But yeah, we certainly haven't incorporated some of the major changes of 1.7 right now. But we are running this ontology within Vitro 1.7, which supports all this stuff well.
Okay, I see. Yeah. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. All right. If there aren't any more questions, Chris, I guess I can sign off.
Well, I was just going to make one statement before you go. I was trying to leave the floor open, but I think it's pretty awesome between the last call where Violetta had these fantastic descriptions for all their local elements. So she really filled out the description property for all the local ones. You guys have some pretty fantastic view diagrams. Did you find that was a helpful process? So for these other people making local extensions, do you recommend that they go and make diagrams?
Yeah, absolutely. And the view software makes putting stuff like this together very easy. Yeah, we actually prepared all this as part of our migration to Vitro 1.7, just sort of to actually go through everything and pick out the parts of the ontology that we were using and figure out what needed to be migrated from the old system to the new one. And so yeah, this is a very useful process. And it's good for documentation, and it helps us also sort of see where we need to build things out a little bit more. And so yeah, I'd recommend it as an academic exercise, if nothing else. And I'd say the view software is very helpful with that.
Now, do you also annotate the each one of the ones in your ontology files with descriptions?
I would say the documentation is in varying consistency. Right now, especially a lot of the B-local stuff is provisional, and will hopefully be put into more formal descriptions later on. Again, right now, the primary focus was just in terms of getting things into a working state. And again, to be perfectly honest, a lot of the local ontology extensions we put together aren't really designed for public consumption. I mean, people are certainly welcome to use it, but our B display classes, for instance, will probably only have meaning within the Brown context.
Well, thank you for sharing, though. I think it's pretty fantastic that you're sharing, and I think that even if people don't consume your ontology extensions, they can look at the way that you guys manage yours and use that as kind of a lesson. You guys have had local extensions from the beginning, so it's a pretty you've been going for a little while now. It's almost a year that you guys have been online, right? Live?
Yeah, it's coming up on a year, and nothing, no terrible crashes or anything like that. So, yeah.
At least not because of the local extensions, right?
Exactly.
Well, thanks for coming, everybody. And if there's no more questions for Brian or Steven, I think we'll call it a day. And I apologize for my technical difficulties calling in late, trying to get the call going. Thank you to Ted for starting it. The next ontology call will be April 7th. And the next apps and tools call is on March 24th. So again, the next ontology call is April 7th. And the next apps and tools call is March 24th. And if we have any volunteers that would like to do any presentations,
Thanks, Chris.
Please feel free to contact Ted or I. Otherwise, we'll probably be reaching out to you guys and asking for another local extension demonstration. But thanks, everybody, and have a great Tuesday.
Bye, everybody.